Caleb Mercer came down from the peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains looking for supplies, not a wife. But when he saw the terrified eyes of a young woman being auctioned off like cattle in the muddy center of Blackwood Creek, something in his chest tightened, a feeling he hadn't known since the war. He paid the price. He took the girl. He thought he was saving a helpless soul from a cruel fate. He was wrong. The woman he brought up that mountain wasn't just a victim. She was the keeper of a deadly secret that would bring the wrath of the most powerful men in the territory right to his front door. This is the story of how a silent bargain became a war for survival. Blackwood Creek smelled of wet pine, unwashed bodies, and desperation. It was a boomtown that had already busted, clinging to the edge of the Montana territory like a tick on a stray dog. Caleb Mercer adjusted the strap of his Henry repeating rifle, his boots sinking slightly into the muck of the main thoroughfare. He was a man carved from the very granite of the mountains he called home, tall, broad-shouldered, with a beard that hid a jaw set in perpetual stoicism. He came to town once a month, just long enough to trade furs for coffee, flour, and ammunition, before retreating back to the silence of the high timber. He had no use for civilization. Civilization had taken his brother during the war and his family during the fever of '78. A commotion near the livery stables drew his attention away from the general store. A circle of men had formed, jeering and laughing, their breath misting in the crisp autumn air. "Speak up, girl! Show 'em you ain't simple!" a voice bellowed. It was a harsh, rasping sound, like a saw cutting through a knot. Caleb usually ignored the squabbles of townfolk, but the tone of the crowd was ugly. It wasn't a fight, it was a spectacle. He moved closer, his height allowing him to see over the bowler hats and Stetsons of the gawkers. In the center of the ring stood a man named Tobias Miller. Tobias was a drifter, known for cheating at cards and drinking away whatever coin he scrounged. Beside him, tethered by a rough length of hemp rope around her wrist, was a young woman. She was small, perhaps 20 years old, though malnutrition made her look younger. Her dress was gray, homespun wool, stained with mud and travel, but it was her face that stopped Caleb in his tracks. She was pale, her features sharp and delicate, framed by hair the color of dried wheat that had escaped a haphazard braid. Her eyes, a striking shade of violet blue, darted frantically around the circle of leering men, but she made no sound. Not a whimper, not a cry. She's strong enough for farm work and pretty enough for, well, whatever else you need, Tobias shouted, holding up her arm like a prize horse. Lost her voice in a fire years back. Can't nag you, can't gossip. Perfect wife for a working man. Laughter rippled through the crowd. "I'll give you $1 for her! Tobias!" shouted a miner with a missing ear. $1? She's worth 10! Look at them teeth! Tobias grabbed her jaw, forcing her mouth open. She flinched, pulling back, but the rope went taut, snapping her head forward. Caleb felt a cold rage settle in his gut. It was a familiar sensation, one he had spent 10 years trying to bury under snow and solitude. He watched as the bidding stalled at $3. The man winning was a trapper named Silas Vane, a man Caleb knew. Vane was cruel to his dogs. Caleb could only imagine how he treated a human. Vane stepped forward, fishing grease-stained coins from his pocket. $3. Tobias. Hand her over. The girl looked at Vane, then at the crowd. Her eyes landed on Caleb. For a fleeting second, the panic in them vanished, replaced by a hollow, haunting resignation. It was the look of a soldier who knew the bullet was coming. Caleb stepped into the circle. The crowd parted instinctively. He carried the scent of ozone and pine resin, a stark contrast to the whiskey and sweat of the town. $50, Caleb said. His voice was low, a rumble of thunder in a canyon. The silence was instant. $50 was a fortune in Blackwood Creek. It was enough to buy a team of good mules or build a small barn. Tobias's eyes bulged. He dropped the girl's arm. 50? Gold? Caleb reached into his duster coat and produced a small leather pouch. He tossed it to Tobias. It hit the man's chest with a heavy thud. Gold dust. Weigh it if you want. It's more than 50. Silas Vane spat on the ground, his face reddening. You can't just buy a woman like she's a sack of grain, Mercer. It ain't right. Caleb turned his gaze to Vane. Tobias is selling. I'm buying. Unless you 60? Vane growled but stepped back, his hand hovering near his pistol before falling away. No one in Blackwood Creek was foolish enough to draw on Caleb Mercer. She's yours, Mountain Man! Tobias cackled, tearing open the pouch to inspect the dust. Take the rope. Caleb ignored the rope. He walked up to the girl. Up close, he saw the bruise on her cheekbone and the tremors in her hands. He pulled a hunting knife from his belt. The crowd gasped, and the girl flinched, squeezing her eyes shut. With a single fluid motion, Caleb severed the rope binding her wrist. "You're coming with me," he said, sheathing the knife. "Get in the wagon." She opened her eyes, staring at the severed rope, then up at him. There was no gratitude yet, only confusion. She hesitated. "Now," Caleb said, not unkindly, but with command. She scrambled toward the buckboard wagon parked near the general store. Caleb climbed onto the bench seat, took the reins, and snapped them over the backs of his two massive Clydesdales. He didn't look back at Tobias, Vane, or the town. He headed north, toward the timberline, toward the clouds. He had bought a wife. Or a servant. He wasn't sure what he had bought, only that he couldn't leave her there. But as the wagon rattled over the bridge leaving town, Caleb noticed a man in a pristine gray suit watching them from the balcony of the mayor's office. It was Josiah Higgins, the wealthiest rancher in the territory. Higgins wasn't smiling. He was watching the girl with an intensity that made the hair on the back of Caleb's neck stand up. Caleb flicked the reins. They needed to be above the snow line before dark. The journey up the mountain was grueling. The trail to Caleb's cabin was little more than a deer track widened by years of careful wagon use, winding through switchbacks that dropped thousands of feet into the valley below. For the first 2 hours, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the creaking of the wagon wheels, the snort of the horses, and the wind whistling through the Douglas firs. The girl sat on the far edge of the bench, clutching her knees. She shivered violently. The air in town had been brisk. Up here, it was biting. Caleb sighed. He halted the horses for a moment, reached behind the seat, and pulled out a heavy buffalo robe. He tossed it onto her lap. "Put it on," he said, staring straight ahead. "You freeze to death. I wasted $50. It was a harsh joke, meant to keep a distance between them, but she didn't react to the words. She wrapped the fur around her shoulders, burying her face in the warmth. "What's your name?" Caleb asked after another mile. "Silence." He glanced at her. She was looking at the horizon. "Tobias said you were mute. Is that true? Or just stubborn?" She turned to him. She opened her mouth, and he saw her throat work, the muscles straining. A raspy exhale of air came out, but no words. She tapped her throat with 2 fingers and shook her head, her expression frustrated. "All right," Caleb nodded. "Understood." He didn't press her. In truth, he preferred silence. He had spent years cultivating it. But having another human being breathing beside him was a shock to his system. It felt loud, even without words. By late afternoon, the sky turned a bruised purple, and the temperature plummeted. They reached the plateau where Caleb's cabin stood. It was a sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs, built to withstand avalanches and wolf packs. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney. Caleb had banked the fire well before leaving that morning. He pulled the wagon into the barn, unhitched the horses, and began rubbing them down. The girl stood in the center of the barn, looking lost. "Go inside," Caleb said, pointing to the cabin. "Door's unlocked. Warm yourself." She hesitated, looking at the dark interior of the barn, then at him. She seemed to be weighing which was the lesser threat, the cold or the strange man. Finally, she turned and walked toward the cabin. When Caleb entered 20 minutes later, carrying a sack of flour and a side of bacon, he found her standing by the fireplace. She hadn't sat down. She hadn't taken off the buffalo robe. She was staring at the mantel. On the mantel sat a tintype photograph in a silver frame. It was a picture of a woman and a small boy, Caleb's wife and son, dead 6 years now. Caleb set the groceries on the rough-hewn table. That was Martha and little Jim. The girl jumped, spinning around. She looked from the photo to Caleb, her eyes wide. She seemed to be searching his face for grief, or perhaps checking if he was the kind of man who would lash out at her for looking. "Sit," Caleb said, gesturing to the chair by the fire. He set about making dinner. He was efficient, movements practiced. He sliced bacon, cracked eggs into a skillet, and cut thick slabs of sourdough bread. The smell of frying pork filled the small cabin, chasing away the musty scent of solitude. He plated the food and set it before her. She stared at it. "Eat," he commanded. "I don't hold with starving." She picked up the fork, her hand trembling. She took a bite, then another. Suddenly, she was eating ravenously, shoving the food into her mouth as if she hadn't seen a hot meal in weeks. Caleb poured 2 cups of black coffee. He sat opposite her, nursing his cup, watching her. "I am Caleb," he said. "Caleb Mercer. This is my land. You are safe here. No one comes up this high unless I let them." She slowed down, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. She looked at him, then dipped her finger into the condensation on her water glass. On the dark wood of the table, she traced letters. Sarah. "Sarah," Caleb read. She nodded. "Well, Sarah, there's a loft upstairs with a bed. That's yours. I sleep down here." She paused, the fork halfway to her mouth. She looked at the ladder leading to the loft, then back at Caleb, confusion knitting her brow. She clearly expected something else. A man who paid $50 for a woman usually expected a return on his investment immediately. "I didn't buy you for that," Caleb said, reading her look. His voice was gruff. "I bought you because Tobias Miller is a pig, and I had the gold." Sarah stared at him for a long time. Then, slowly, she lowered the fork. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over onto her pale cheeks. She didn't sob. She just let them fall. Caleb felt a pang of discomfort. He stood up abruptly. "I need to check the stock." He fled the cabin, stepping out into the freezing night air. He lit a cheroot, his hands shaking slightly. He looked out over the valley. The lights of Blackwood Creek were far below, tiny pinpricks in the dark. Why had she looked so terrified in town? It wasn't just Tobias. When he had driven the wagon away, he had seen her looking back, not at Tobias, but at the mayor's office. Caleb puffed on the smoke. Josiah Higgins. The man owned the bank, the sheriff, and half the grazing land in the county. Why would a mute girl be worried about the richest man in Montana? Caleb stomped out the cheroot. He had a feeling his quiet life was over. He went back inside and bolted the heavy oak door. For the first time in years, he checked the load in his revolver before setting it on the nightstand. Up in the loft, he could hear the soft rustle of straw ticking as Sarah settled in. She was safe for tonight. But the mountain wind was picking up, howling around the eaves like a warning. For the first 2 weeks, a fragile rhythm established itself in the cabin. Sarah was a hard worker. Without being asked, she took over the domestic duties that Caleb had neglected for years. She scrubbed the floors until the wood grain shone. She mended the tears in his coats. She took the meager supplies he had and turned them into stews seasoned with dried sage and wild onions she found near the creek. Caleb continued his work, felling timber, checking trap lines, and preparing the cabin for the deep snows of winter that were fast approaching. They rarely interacted during the day, but at night, the silence between them began to change. It was no longer the tense silence of strangers. It was a companionable quiet. One evening, Caleb brought out a piece of charcoal and a smooth piece of birch bark. He placed it on the table in front of her. "Paper is expensive," he grunted. "This works just as well. If you need to say something, write it." Sarah touched the bark, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. She picked up the charcoal. "Thank you," she wrote. "Don't thank me yet," Caleb muttered, whittling a piece of pine by the fire. "Winter up here is hard. Makes people crazy." "I have seen worse," she wrote back. Caleb stopped whittling. He looked at her. "With Tobias?" She shook her head. Her face darkened. She wrote quickly, the charcoal snapping with the force of her hand. "Before Tobias, I worked at the Golden Slipper Saloon, cleaning. Not the other work." Caleb nodded. "The Golden Slipper was in Blackwood Creek. A rough place. I saw things," she continued. "Men talk when they think the girl is dumb and mute." Caleb leaned forward. "What did you hear, Sarah?" She hesitated. Her hand hovered over the bark. She looked at the bolted door, fear flickering in her eyes again. Just then, the dogs in the barn barked, a frenzied, aggressive sound. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, the Winchester rifle in his hands before the piece of wood he was whittling hit the floor. He blew out the oil lamp, plunging the room into darkness lit only by the dying embers of the fire. "Get in the root cellar," he whispered. "Under the rug. Go." Sarah didn't argue. She scrambled under the heavy bearskin rug and lifted the trapdoor, disappearing into the darkness beneath the floorboards. Caleb moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. 3 riders were approaching the cabin. They carried torches, casting long, dancing shadows against the snow-dusted trees. They weren't trying to be stealthy. Caleb recognized the lead horse. It was a massive white stallion, decked in silver-studded tack. He didn't need to see the rider's face to know who it was. It was Sheriff Amos Grady, and flanking him were two of Josiah Higgins's hired guns, men known as the Spectres of the Valley because they left no witnesses. "Mercer!" the sheriff's voice boomed. "Open up! Official business!" Caleb cracked the door open, keeping the chain latched. He leveled the barrel of the Winchester through the gap. "It's midnight, Amos," Caleb shouted back. "My business hours are closed." "Don't be difficult, Caleb," the sheriff said, his horse pawing the ground. "We heard you bought a girl, a mute girl. I bought a wife," Caleb corrected. "She's sleeping. We need to see her." One of the hired guns sneered. "There's been a theft in town. Mayor Higgins is missing a very valuable ledger. We think the girl might have taken it before she was sold." Caleb's mind raced. A ledger. That explained why Tobias sold her so quickly. He probably found the book and got scared, or she planted it on him and he didn't know, or maybe she hid it. "She has nothing but the rags she came in," Caleb said. "Get off my land, Amos. You have no warrant. I am the law," Amos shouted, his hand dropping to his gun. Bang. Caleb put a bullet into the dirt right between the sheriff's horse's hooves. The stallion reared, nearly throwing the lawman. "That was a warning," Caleb said, his voice cold steel. "The next one takes your hat off. This is mountain law up here. Trespassers get shot." The hired guns drew their weapons, but Amos waved them down. He struggled to control his horse, his face purple with rage in the torchlight. "You're making a mistake, Mercer, a big mistake. That girl is poison. You protect her, and you burn with her. I like the fire." Caleb deadpanned. "Now ride." Amos glared at the cabin for a long moment, then wheeled his horse around. "We'll be back, Mercer, and we'll bring enough men to turn this cabin into kindling." They thundered off into the night. Caleb watched them until their torches disappeared around the bend. He barred the door and reloaded the spent cartridge. He pulled the rug back and opened the trap door. Sarah was huddled in the corner of the cellar, clutching a small, oilskin-wrapped package to her chest. Caleb helped her up. He pointed to the package. "Is that the ledger?" Sarah nodded slowly. She looked terrified that he would take it, that he would turn her in. Caleb sighed, rubbing his temples. "Put it on the table. Let's see what's worth dying for." She unwrapped the oilskin. Inside was a black leather book. Caleb opened it. It wasn't just numbers. It was a list of names, dates, and payments. October 12th. Judge Calloway, $500. Ruling on water rights. November 4th. Sheriff Grady, $200. Silence on the Miller fire. December 1st. Federal Marshal Tate, $1,000. Railway diversion approval. Caleb's blood ran cold. This book proved that Josiah Higgins wasn't just a rancher. He was bribing every official in the territory to steal land for the coming railroad. He was stealing water rights, burning out farmers, and paying the law to look the other way. And there was one entry at the very back, written in a hurried scrawl, January 15th. Ambush at Rattlesnake Pass. Eliminate Governor's surveyor. That date was 3 days from now. Caleb looked at Sarah. She had stolen the most dangerous object in Montana. "They won't stop coming," Caleb said softly. "You know that, right?" Sarah picked up the charcoal. Her hand was steady now. "I know. But I couldn't let them kill the surveyor too. My father was a surveyor. Higgins killed him." Caleb looked at the girl. No, the woman, standing before him. She wasn't a broken bird. She was a fighter who had lost her voice, screaming into the void, and decided to use action instead. Caleb clook. He walked over to the gun rack and pulled down a double-barreled shotgun and a box of shells. He placed them on the table. "Do you know how to shoot?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "Good," Caleb said, a grim smile hidden in his beard. "Because war is coming to the mountain, and I'll be damned if I let them win." The dawn broke gray and heavy, the sky a slab of iron pressing down on the peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains. The air smelled of impending snow, the kind of deep, burying snow that the old-timers called the White Death. Caleb and Sarah did not sleep. They spent the hours of darkness turning the cabin into a fortress. Caleb moved with the efficiency of a man who had seen siege warfare during the campaign in Virginia. He overturned the heavy oak table, pushing it against the main window to serve as a shield. He pried up floorboards near the door to create a trip hazard for anyone who breached the threshold. Sarah worked alongside him, her delicate frame belying a steely resolve. She didn't flinch when Caleb handed her the heavy Colt Navy revolver. She weighed it in her hand, checking the cylinder mechanism. It pulls to the left, Caleb warned, watching her. Aim slightly right of center. She nodded, tucking the weapon into the sash of her dress. She then moved to the pantry, tearing strips of cloth from an old sheet and soaking them in kerosene. She stuffed them into empty whiskey bottles. Molotov cocktails were a crude weapon, but in the close quarters of a siege, fire was a terrifying deterrent. By mid-morning, the preparation was done. The cabin was dark, the shutters barred, the only light coming from the slits Caleb had carved for rifle ports. Caleb sat on a crate, cleaning his Henry rifle. He watched Sarah across the room. She was braiding her hair tight against her scalp, her face set in a grim line. "You should know," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "If they take us alive, it won't be quick. Higgins can't afford for you to testify. And he can't afford for me to talk about who came for us." Sarah stopped braiding. She walked over to him, her footsteps silent on the wood. She reached out and took his rough, calloused hand in hers. She turned it over, tracing the scar that ran across his palm, a souvenir from a knife fight in Abilene years ago. She picked up the charcoal from the floor. On the crate beside him, she wrote, "I am not afraid of dying. I am afraid of living on my knees. You gave me a chance to stand. That is enough." Caleb felt a lump form in his throat. He had lived alone for so long, convinced that humanity was nothing but greed and noise. Yet here, in the face of certain death, this silent woman showed more courage than any captain he had served under. "We aren't dying today," Caleb growled, gripping her hand. "The surveyor, the man they want to ambush, his name is on the list?" Sarah nodded. She opened the ledger to the back page. "Arthur Pendleton, U.S. Geological Survey." "Pendleton," Caleb mused. "I know him. He's a straight arrow. If we can get this book to him, he has the power to bring in the federal cavalry from Fort Benton. Higgins owns the sheriff, but he doesn't own the U.S. Army." The plan was forming. It was desperate, bordering on suicidal. They couldn't just defend the cabin. That was a waiting game they would lose. They had to break out. They had to cross the ridge, descend into Rattlesnake Pass, and intercept Pendleton before Higgins's hit squad did. But before they could move, the wind changed. A low moan started in the chimney, growing rapidly into a shriek. The trees outside began to thrash violently. The temperature in the cabin dropped 10 degrees in minutes. "The storm," Caleb cursed, standing up and peering through a rifle slit. "It's early." Snow began to drive sideways, a white curtain obliterating the world outside. Visibility dropped to near zero. "We can't leave in this," Caleb said, slamming his hand against the wall. "We'd freeze before we made the ridge. We're trapped until it breaks." Sarah touched his arm. She pointed to the window. Through the swirling white chaos, a shadow moved, then another. They were not waiting for the storm to pass. They were using it. "They're here," Caleb whispered, cocking the Henry. "Get down!" The first shot didn't sound like a bang. It sounded like a crack of a whip. The wood of the shutter splintered inches from Caleb's face. "Stay low!" he roared. A barrage of gunfire erupted from the tree line. Bullets hammered the log walls, thudding into the thick timber. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of lead biting into wood. Caleb moved to the port. He couldn't see targets, only muzzle flashes in the gray soup of the blizzard. He fired back, working the lever of his rifle. Crack, clack, crack, clack. He aimed for the flashes, suppressing their fire. "They're trying to flank us," Caleb shouted over the wind. "Watch the back door!" Sarah scrambled to the rear of the cabin. She pressed her back against the wall, the Colt held in both hands. She watched the heavy wooden bar across the rear door. Thump! Something heavy hit the door. Thump! Someone was trying to ram it. Sarah didn't panic. She waited. She watched the wood around the hinges. As the door buckled under another heavy blow, she saw a gap appear. A hand reached through, trying to lift the bar. Sarah stepped forward, extended her arms, and fired. The recoil jerked her arms up, the explosion loud in the small space. A scream from outside cut through the wind. The hand vanished. She looked at Caleb. He offered a grim nod of approval. She had drawn first blood, but the gunfire from the front intensified. They weren't just shooting randomly anymore. They were concentrating fire on the hinges of the front door. They brought a Gatling. Caleb realized with horror as a rhythmic thud, 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 thud began to chew through the front logs. Higgins brought a damn Gatling gun. The logs wouldn't hold forever. Splinters sprayed the room like shrapnel. A piece of wood sliced Caleb's cheek, blood masking one side of his face. "We can't stay here," Caleb yelled. "They'll cut the cabin in half." He looked at the trapdoor to the root cellar. Then he looked at the fireplace. "Sarah, the kerosene bombs!" She grabbed 2 of the bottles. "When I open the shutter, throw them! Aim for the gun!" It was a suicide move. To open the shutter was to invite death. Caleb moved to the window. "Ready?" Sarah nodded, her eyes blazing violet fire. "Now!" Caleb threw the shutter open. A hail of bullets buzzed through the opening like angry hornets. Sarah stepped into the line of fire, wound up, and hurled the first bottle, then the second. She dove to the floor just as a bullet shattered the tintype of Caleb's wife on the mantel behind her. Outside, a dull whump was followed by screaming. The rhythmic thumping of the Gatling gun stopped. "You hit it!" Caleb yelled, pulling her up. "Grab the furs. Grab the ledger. We're leaving." "Leaving?" She gestured to the storm. "The smoke will confuse them for a minute. It's our only chance. We go out the back, into the trees. We hunt them in the snow." Caleb Mercer didn't wait. He kicked open the back door, and together they ran into the white, freezing hell of the blizzard. The cold hit them like a physical blow. It was 20 degrees below zero, and the wind chill was lethal. The snow was already knee-deep, dragging at their boots with every step. Caleb led the way, hunched over, his body shielding Sarah from the worst of the wind. They moved away from the cabin, circling wide into the dense timber of the Blue Ridge slope. Behind them, the cabin was beginning to burn. One of the attackers must have tossed a torch. The flames licked up the side of the structure, casting an eerie, flickering orange glow against the swirling snow. "Down," Caleb hissed, pulling Sarah behind a fallen Douglas fir. 3 shapes emerged from the gloom near the burning cabin. They were wrapped in heavy coats, scarves covering their faces. "Where are they?" one voice shouted. It was Silas Vane. "I don't see bodies!" "They rabbit-ed," another voice answered. This one was deeper, calm, and terrifyingly controlled. Caleb recognized it. It was a man named Cole Riker. Riker wasn't a hired gun. He was a bounty hunter from Nevada, a man who specialized in tracking fugitives through the high Sierras. Higgins had hired the best. "Tracks!" Riker pointed to the ground. The snow was filling them in fast, but they were still visible. They went into the timber. "In this weather?" Vane laughed nervously. "They'll be dead in an hour." "Not Mercer," Riker said. "He's part wolf. Spread out." "Keep your eyes on the trees. He'll double back." Caleb pressed his lips to Sarah's ear. "Riker is dangerous. We have to separate them." Sarah looked terrified. She grabbed his sleeve, shaking her head. "Trust me," Caleb whispered. "You take the high trail. Climb the ridge. Wait at the Wolf's Head rock formation. I will draw them down into the gully." She gripped the ledger against her chest. She wanted to argue, but she had no voice to do it. She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "I will come for you," Caleb promised. "I bought you, remember? Protect my investment." He kissed her forehead. A brief, hard contact, and then pushed her toward the slope. Sarah hesitated for a second, then turned and began to climb. She moved lightly, her smaller frame sinking less into the snow. She vanished into the whiteout. Caleb waited a beat, then deliberately broke a branch on the fallen log. Snap. The sound was sharp in the cold air. "Over there!" Vane shouted. Caleb took off running, not trying to hide his tracks now. He headed downhill, toward the deep gully that cut through the property. It was a treacherous place, filled with loose scree hidden under the snow. "Get him!" Riker's voice commanded. Bullets zipped past Caleb, stripping bark from the pines. He didn't fire back. He needed them to chase. He needed them reckless. He reached the edge of the gully. It was a 20-foot drop into darkness. He didn't stop. He jumped, sliding down the steep embankment, snow cascading around him. He hit the bottom hard, rolling to absorb the impact. He scrambled behind a large boulder. Above him, on the ridge, the pursuers halted. "I see him!" a man yelled. It was one of the deputies. The deputy slid down the embankment, sliding out of control. Caleb stepped out from behind the boulder. He didn't use the rifle. He used the butt of the stock, swinging it in a brutal arc. It connected with the deputy's jaw. The man went down without a sound. One down. 5 to go. "Hold fire!" Riker yelled from above. "He's baiting you!" But Silas Vane was greedy. He wanted the bounty. "I'm going down there and gutting him!" Vane and 2 others began to descend, moving more carefully. Caleb retreated deeper into the gully. The walls were narrowing. This was his territory. He knew every rock, every twist. He stopped at a bend where the gully turned sharply. He wedged himself into a crevice in the rock wall, becoming invisible against the gray stone. Vane came around the corner, a shotgun in his hands. He looked left, right. He didn't look up. Caleb dropped from the crevice, landing on Vane's back. They crashed into the snow. The shotgun went off, blasting a hole in the sky. Caleb rolled, pulling his hunting knife. Vane scrambled for his backup pistol, but Caleb was faster. He pinned Vane's hand to the frozen ground. "Where is Higgins?" Caleb growled, the blade hovering over Vane's throat. "Town!" Vane sputtered, his eyes wide with terror. "He's at the hotel, waiting for the book! And the surveyor, the ambush! It's moved up! Tomorrow noon, Rattlesnake Pass, tomorrow!" They had less time than Caleb thought. Caleb knocked Vane unconscious with the pommel of the knife. He didn't kill him. The cold would decide his fate. Suddenly, a shot rang out from high above, from the direction Sarah had gone. Caleb's heart stopped. It was the sharp crack of a long-range rifle. Riker. Riker hadn't followed Caleb into the gully. The bounty hunter had been smart. He knew Caleb would try to draw the heat away. Riker had followed the girl. "Sarah!" Caleb breathed. He abandoned stealth. He scrambled up the far side of the gully, clawing at the frozen earth, his fingernails tearing. He crested the ridge and began to run back uphill, his lungs burning in the freezing air. The Wolf's Head rock was a quarter-mile up. Another shot echoed through the mountains. Then silence. Caleb pushed his body past the limit of endurance. He crested the final rise and burst into the clearing near the rock formation. The snow was stained red. Sarah was lying near the base of the rock. The ledger spilled in the snow beside her. Riker stood over her, his rifle smoking. He heard Caleb approach and turned, a cruel smile on his face. "She runs fast for a mute," Riker said calmly. "But not fast enough," Caleb roared. A sound of pure, animalistic fury. He raised his Winchester. Riker was faster. He snapped his rifle up. Bang! Caleb felt a sledgehammer hit his shoulder. The impact spun him around, and he fell into the snow. His rifle flew from his hand. He lay on his back, staring up at the swirling gray sky. Pain radiated from his shoulder, hot and blinding. Riker walked over, his boots crunching in the snow. He stood over Caleb, blocking out the sky. "Good effort, Mercer," Riker said. "But the game is over. I'll take the book. I'll take your head. And Higgins will be the king of Montana." Riker leveled his rifle at Caleb's heart. Caleb tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. He looked past Riker, toward Sarah. She wasn't moving. "I failed," Caleb thought. "I failed her." Riker's finger tightened on the trigger. Cleek. The hammer fell on a dud cartridge. Riker frowned, confused. He racked the lever to load a fresh round. In that split second of delay, a movement flashed behind him. Sarah wasn't dead. She pushed herself up from the snow. The red stain wasn't hers. It was from a rabbit she had crushed in her fall, or perhaps Riker had merely grazed her. She held the heavy Colt Navy revolver in both hands. Her face was pale as death, but her eyes were open. Riker spun around, sensing her. Sarah didn't hesitate this time. She didn't aim for the leg or the arm. She aimed for the center of the mass. Boom. The Colt roared. Riker jerked backward as if kicked by a mule. The bullet took him in the chest. He dropped to his knees, looking down at the spreading stain on his coat with disbelief. He looked at the mute girl he had dismissed as prey. He tried to raise his rifle again. Sarah walked forward. She cocked the heavy hammer of the revolver with both thumbs. Boom. Riker fell face forward into the snow and did not move again. The silence returned to the mountain, heavier than before. Sarah dropped the gun. She ran to Caleb, falling to her knees beside him. Tears streamed down her face, freezing instantly. She pressed her hands against his bleeding shoulder. Caleb looked up at her, his vision blurring. "You!" he rasped, a bloody smile touching his lips. "You aim right of center," she nodded, sobbing silently. She ripped a strip from her petticoat and began to bind his wound. "We have to go," Caleb whispered, fighting unconsciousness. Rattlesnake Pass, tomorrow. Sarah looked at the storm, then at Caleb's wound. It was madness. But they had killed Riker. They had the book. And now they had nothing left to lose. She helped him stand. Leaning on the small, mute woman who had just killed a legendary bounty hunter, the wounded mountain man began the long, limping march toward destiny. The journey to Rattlesnake Pass was a descent into a frozen hell. Caleb was losing blood. The bandage Sarah had tied was soaked through, a stark crimson against his tattered coat. He leaned heavily on her, his breathing ragged and shallow. Sarah bore his weight without complaint. Her small boots broke the crust of the snow, every step a battle against exhaustion. They moved like ghosts through the timber, driven only by the terrifying knowledge of what awaited Arthur Pendleton at noon. They reached the overlook above the pass just as the sun reached its zenith. The storm had broken, leaving the sky a blinding, cloudless blue that offered no warmth. Below them, the trail narrowed between two sheer cliffs, a perfect kill zone. Caleb collapsed behind a rocky outcrop, his face gray. He pulled a brass spyglass from his pocket with trembling hands and peered down. "There," he rasped, handing the glass to Sarah. She looked. Hidden among the boulders on the north side of the pass were 4 men. She recognized the sheriff, Amos Grady, and 3 more of Higgins's deputies. They had rifles trained on the southern approach. And coming from the south, unaware of the death waiting for him, was a small caravan, a buggy and 2 outriders, the U.S. Geological Survey team. We can't get down there in time," Caleb whispered, his eyes closing. "I can't steady the rifle, Sarah." "I can't hold it." Sarah looked at the men below. They were too far for the revolver. They needed the range of the Winchester. She looked at Caleb. He was fading fast. If she did nothing, the surveyor died, the proof died, and Caleb would be hunted down and hanged. Sarah picked up Caleb's heavy Henry rifle. She had never fired a long gun before. It was heavy, the wood stock cold against her cheek. "Prop it," Caleb murmured, fighting to stay conscious. "On the rock. Take a deep breath. Let it out halfway. Squeeze." She rested the barrel on the granite. She looked through the sights. She aimed not at the men, but at the rock wall directly above the sheriff's head. There was a heavy drift of snow hanging precariously over the ledge. She closed one eye. She thought of the auction block. She thought of the rope on her wrist. She thought of Caleb standing in the mud, offering gold for a broken thing. She squeezed the trigger. Crack. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder, bruising the bone. The bullet struck the rock face. It didn't kill anyone, but the impact shattered a key support of the snowdrift. Tons of white powder and ice sheared off the cliffside. "Avalanche!" a deputy screamed below. The sheriff and his men scrambled, away from the falling sheet of snow. It buried their position, burying their rifles and their horses in a chaotic white tumble. The noise alerted the caravan. The surveyor's outriders drew their weapons, halting the buggy instantly. "Now!" Caleb hissed. "Shoot into the air! Warn Pendleton!" Sarah worked the lever, clack, clack, and fired 3 rapid shots into the sky. The surveyor's team realized it was an ambush. They wheeled the buggy around, the outriders providing cover fire toward the snow-dazed deputies emerging from the drift. But Sheriff Grady wasn't buried deep enough. He clawed his way out of the snow, his face a mask of fury. He spotted the smoke from Sarah's rifle on the ridge. "There! On the cliff!" Grady screamed. He raised his revolver, firing blindly up the slope. A bullet ricocheted off the rock inches from Sarah's face, sending stone splinters into her skin. She flinched, falling back. "They're coming up," Caleb groaned. He tried to stand, but his legs gave out. Sarah grabbed him by the collar. She pointed to a narrow deer trail leading down the backside of the ridge, away from the pass. It was steep, dangerous, but it led toward the main road where the surveyor had fled. "Go!" Caleb whispered. "Leave me! I'll hold them off." Sarah shook her head violently. She grabbed the charcoal from his pocket. She scribbled on the stock of the rifle. "Toger." She pulled him up. Adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. They practically slid down the back trail, tumbling through brush and shale. They reached the road just as the surveyor's buggy came tearing back. The driver saw them, a giant of a man bleeding out, supported by a wild-eyed woman holding a rifle. "Stop!" the passenger commanded. It was Arthur Pendleton, a man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the stern bearing of a government official. The buggy skidded to a halt. The outriders leveled their guns. "Don't shoot!" Pendleton barked. He looked at Caleb. Mercer? Is that Caleb Mercer? Caleb nodded weakly. Higgins sent the sheriff. Sarah stepped forward. She reached into her dress and pulled out the black ledger. She slammed it onto the seat of the buggy, her hand bloody, her eyes fierce. Pendleton opened the book. He saw the list. He saw his own name marked for death on this very day. He looked up toward the ridge, where Sheriff Grady was just appearing, panting and furious. Sheriff! Pendleton shouted, his voice ringing with federal authority. I am a representative of the United States government. I have here evidence of conspiracy to commit murder, bribery, and treason. If you fire one more shot, I will have the entire cavalry detachment from Fort Ellis burn your badge to ash, Grady froze. He looked at the buggy. He looked at the outriders, who now had Winchester rifles aimed at his chest. He looked at the ledger in Pendleton's hand. The law of the gun had just run into the law of the land. It's over, Amos, Caleb whispered, before the darkness finally took him. The trial of Josiah Higgins was not held in the muddy makeshift court of Blackwood Creek. It was moved to the territorial capital, Helena, presided over by the formidable Judge Isaac Parker, known throughout the West for his intolerance of corruption. The courtroom was packed. Miners, trappers, and ranchers squeezed into the pews, sensing that the reign of the cattle barons was coming to an end. Caleb sat in the front row, his arm in a sling, his face pale but clean-shaven. He looked uncomfortable in a borrowed suit. Beside him sat Sarah. She wore a simple blue dress Caleb had bought her, her hair brushed to a shine. She looked small amidst the shouting lawyers and the imposing architecture of justice, but she did not look afraid. Higgins sat at the defense table, looking diminished. Stripped of his hired guns and his bought sheriff, he was just a greedy old man in a wrinkled suit. The prosecutor, a young man named Jeremiah Black, laid out the case. He presented the ledger. He presented the testimony of the surveyor. But Higgins's lawyer, a slick man from Chicago, sneered. This ledger, the lawyer argued, pacing the floor, is inadmissible. It was stolen by a mute, simple-minded girl. A girl known to be unstable. How do we know she didn't forge these entries? How can we trust the word of a woman who cannot even speak to swear an oath? A murmur went through the crowd. It was a valid legal trick. Discredit the source. I call Sarah Mercer to the stand, the lawyer challenged. Let her tell us where she got it. Oh, wait. She can't. Caleb started to rise, his anger flaring, but placed a hand on his knee. She stood up. She walked to the witness stand. Judge Parker peered over his spectacles. Young woman, can you swear to tell the truth? Sarah nodded. She placed her hand on the Bible. The defense claims you are incompetent, the judge said gently, that you cannot testify. Sarah reached into her pocket. She pulled out the piece of slate she now carried. She wrote quickly, the chalk scratching loudly in the silent room. She turned the slate to the judge, then to the jury. The truth does not need a voice. It needs eyes. Read the book. The Chicago lawyer laughed. Pretty words. But tell me, girl, did you see Josiah Higgins write in that book? Can you speak to that? Sarah looked at Higgins. The old man glared at her, mouthing the word trash. Sarah closed her eyes. She took a deep breath. She remembered the smoke of the Golden Slipper Saloon. She remembered Higgins sitting in the back room, boasting to the sheriff while she scrubbed the floor, invisible to them because she was dumb. She opened her mouth. Her throat felt like it was filled with broken glass. She hadn't spoken a word in 6 years, not since the fire that took her family. The trauma had locked her voice away in a heavy iron box. But looking at Caleb, the man who had nearly died for her, the man who treated her like a queen when the world treated her like cattle, she found the key. It started as a croak, a rough, tearing sound. The courtroom gasped. The lawyer froze. Caleb leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. I saw him. Her voice was raw, deep, and halting, unused and rusty. But it was loud enough. I saw him pay the sheriff. She pointed a shaking finger at Higgins. He said, kill the surveyor. He said, no. Witnesses. Higgins jumped up. She's lying! She's a mute freak! Sit down! Judge Parker banged his gavel, the sound like a gunshot. The witness has spoken, and the court has heard. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Josiah Higgins was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. Sheriff Grady was hanged for the attempted murder of a federal official. The web of corruption that had strangled the valley was cut. 3 months later, the spring thaw had come to the Bitterroot Mountains. The valley was a carpet of wildflowers, bluebells and Indian paintbrush. Caleb sat on the porch of the rebuilt cabin. It was larger now, with a new room added on and glass windows that caught the morning sun. He was whittling a toy horse, the wood shavings curling around his boots. The door opened, and Sarah stepped out. She carried 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to Caleb and sat on the bench beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. Her voice was still quiet, still raspy, and she tired easily when she spoke. But she spoke. "The garden," she said softly, pointing to the patch of tilled earth near the barn. "Radishes are up," Caleb smiled, wrapping his arm around her. "I saw. We'll have a good harvest." He looked at her, really looked at her. The fear was gone from her violet eyes. The haunted look of the auction block had been replaced by a peace that mirrored the mountains themselves. "You know," Caleb said, "I made the best trade of my life in Blackwood Creek." Sarah laughed, a sound that was becoming more frequent, like a melody returning to a forgotten song. $50, she teased, her voice scratching but warm. "Expensive." "Worth every grain of dust," Caleb replied. He kissed the top of her head. They sat there as the sun climbed over the peaks, the lone mountain man and the girl who found her voice, watching the eagles circle the thermals above their home. They didn't need many words anymore. They had the rest of their lives to say them. And that is the story of Caleb and Sarah. It shows that sometimes the loudest love is found in the quietest moments, and that even the most broken among us can find the strength to bring down empires if we have just one person who believes in us. I hope you enjoyed this journey into the Wild West. Writing this story was a roller coaster, and I'd love to know, what was your favorite part? Was it the auction, the siege in the snow, or Sarah finally speaking in the courtroom? Let me know in the comments below. If this story touched your heart or kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next adventure. I upload new stories every week. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.